Story 1. The Late Night Encounter. It was around 2:30 a.m. and I was driving home after a visit to my friend's house. The rain poured heavily, making it nearly impossible to see, and the streets were eerily quiet. I lived in a small rural town where houses were scattered far apart, so the drive was usually peaceful, but tonight felt different. The lack of streetlights made the road look like an endless stretch of darkness. As I passed through a quiet intersection, I noticed something strange. A dark blue sedan was stopped in the middle of the intersection, its headlights cutting through the rain. The car didn't move, even though the light had turned green. My initial thought was that maybe the driver had fallen asleep or was having car trouble, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I passed the car, I tried to glance at the driver but couldn't see clearly through the rain-soaked window. I continued driving, but something made me uneasy. The blue car turned its engine on and began following me. Slowly at first, but then more aggressively. I was just a few miles from home when I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror growing brighter. The car was tailgating me, almost bumper to bumper, despite the rain and slippery conditions. My stomach churned with unease. Then my dashboard light flickered, a tire pressure warning. Of all times, why now? As I glanced at the mirror, I could see the blue car wasn't backing off. It was so close that I could barely see its outline in my mirror. I pushed the accelerator, trying to get home faster, but the warning on my dashboard switched to something more alarming. A flat tire. Panic set in. My tire was slowly losing air, and I had to pull over. Of course, the blue car did the same, pulling up right behind me as I parked on the shoulder of the road. I had no idea what was happening, but I instinctively knew this wasn't a coincidence. Before I could even reach for my phone, 3 men spilled out of the sedan. The panic in my chest shot through the roof. There was no time to think. One of the men was carrying something shiny. At first I thought it was a flashlight, but as he approached my window, the gleam of a gun became clear. He was yelling at me to open the door, and my hands froze on the steering wheel. The man beside me smashed the window with a brutal swing of something hard, shattering the glass. The cold air and rain immediately flooded the car. Before I knew it, the door was ripped open, and I was being dragged out of the vehicle. My mind was blank. Nothing but the sound of my own racing heartbeat and the weight of a gun pressing into the back of my head. I was thrown onto the wet pavement, the rain mixing with the cold concrete. Strangely, I wasn't thinking about the gun or what they could do to me. My mind fixated on how cold and wet the ground was beneath me, trying to distance myself from the reality of the situation. But that didn't last long. A brutal blow to the back of my head snapped me out of my daze, my skull ringing in pain as I crashed into the pavement. Somewhere in the blur of chaos, I heard their car doors slam shut. The sound of tires screeching as they sped away was all I could focus on before I managed to roll over, the pain in my head consuming everything. They'd taken my phone, and I was left helpless. With everything spinning, I staggered to my feet, barely able to keep my balance. I made it to my car, still sitting on the flat tire, and somehow drove home with a ruined car and my mind racing. I called the police once I got inside, but the investigation turned up little. The only thing the authorities were able to confirm was that small tire spikes had been placed in the intersection, likely meant to cause an accident and ambush the victim. I had been lucky. It was clear now that they were prepared for a trap, and I'd narrowly escaped something far worse. The sense of violation and fear lingered for days after. It took me a long time to process the traumatic event, but to this day, I can't stop wondering how much closer I came to something far more dangerous. It was more than just a robbery. It felt like a meticulously planned ambush, and I was just one of the targets in their sick game. I couldn't help but think, what if I hadn't been so lucky? Story 2. The unseen watcher was living in a cozy townhome, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, just far enough from the bustle of the city to feel at peace, but close enough to everything I needed. I had just turned 24 and had been living in that townhouse for 2 years, ever since I moved out on my own at 22. It was the first home I had ever rented for myself. and it felt like a small victory in a life I was slowly building on my own. I had a decent job, a dog named Bear, and a routine that I enjoyed. Little did I know, this routine was about to be shattered in the most terrifying way. It was a rainy evening, around 8 p.m., a few days after I'd gotten home from work. The weather outside had turned dark and gloomy, typical of late fall. I was curled up on the couch with my phone in hand, aimlessly scrolling through social media. Bear, my little fluff ball of a dog, had been lounging near the back door, occasionally staring outside. Suddenly, he started whining and trotting over to me, his way of telling me he needed to go outside. It wasn't uncommon for him to ask for a potty break at this hour, so I stood up, walked over, and opened the door for him. The backyard was small but well kept, with a little fenced-in area where Bear could roam freely. I wasn't concerned about him running off. He was small, fluffy, and as docile as could be. After letting him out, I closed the door behind him, stood in the kitchen for a moment, and started to make myself a snack. Then, within seconds, I heard Bear barking, a frantic, panicked bark that immediately caught my attention. I ran to the door and flung it open, my heart racing. Bear was racing back toward the house, his tail tucked between his legs, eyes wide with fear. He darted inside as fast as he could, and I quickly shut the door behind him. I knelt down to check on him, petting him softly to calm him down. He was trembling, something he never did, not even during storms. My worry deepened. What could have scared him like that? I looked out into the darkened backyard, half expecting to see some wild animal, like a coyote or a raccoon lurking by the fence, but there was nothing. The backyard was empty, save for the trees swaying in the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. Still, Bear wouldn't stop looking at the windows, his eyes constantly shifting as if he were watching something just outside the glass. I did my best to reassure him, but he wasn't having it. I decided to let him sit with me for the rest of the night, so I moved to the couch and let him curl up in my lap. He kept peering at the windows, occasionally growling softly under his breath. It was then that I realized something was wrong. Bear wasn't the type of dog to get this worked up over nothing. Something, or someone, had to have spooked him. I tried to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Then, after about 45 minutes, Bear's behavior grew even more erratic. He suddenly turned his head, his eyes fixated on the window behind me, and let out a low, guttural growl. My heart stopped. I turned slowly, my blood running cold. Right there, just inches from the glass, was a man, his face pressed against the window, his eyes wide open and locked onto mine. His presence was so sudden and unexpected that I couldn't even scream at first. I just stared at him, frozen in place. He stood there for what felt like forever, not moving a muscle, his expression unreadable. I felt my pulse thudding in my ears, and then, as if snapping out of a trance, I jumped back and screamed. Bear began barking furiously, and the man immediately sprinted away from the window, vanishing into the night. I rushed to close the blinds, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I checked the other windows to make sure they were secure, but I was still reeling from the shock of what had just happened. I didn't know this man. I had never seen him before in my life. But what was he doing? Staring at me through the window like that. For the next few minutes I stood there in a daze, trying to process everything. Was it a prank? A random person who thought it would be funny to scare me? But why would someone do that? Why come to my house, in the dead of night, in the rain, to peer into my windows? I couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes, how he seemed to know I was there, how his gaze was cold and calculated. Bear had calmed down slightly, though he was still on edge, watching the windows as if waiting for the man to return. I decided it was best to stay up for a while longer, just to make sure everything was okay. I sat on the couch with Bear curled up beside me, but every time I thought I could relax, my eyes would dart to the windows, expecting to see someone out there again. The paranoia was creeping in. An hour passed and I started to doze off, my eyes growing heavy. But then I woke to the sound of something that made my heart stop. A faint noise, like voices, two men talking. I could hear it clearly from upstairs, in the bedroom. My blood ran cold as I froze, listening intently. My door was locked, but I had no idea what was going on outside my bedroom. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the floor downstairs. The voices were muffled now, but it was clear that someone was inside my home. Someone was moving around, rummaging through things, talking to each other. Bear was up immediately, standing at attention by the door, growling low in his throat. My heart pounded in my chest. I held Bear close, trying to keep him calm, but the terror I felt was overwhelming. I could hear them clearly now. 2 men, and they were getting closer. They were upstairs. I moved quietly across the room, gripping Bear tightly in my arms, trying to stay as silent as possible. My mind raced. What should I do? Should I call the police? I took out my phone, barely able to type, my fingers shaking with fear. I whispered to the 911 operator, telling them what was happening, begging them to send help. The operator assured me they were on their way. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped right outside my bedroom door. I could hear their heavy breathing. Then one of them spoke. "Open the door. We just want to talk." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, holding my breath. The only thing I could hear was the sound of their footsteps moving slowly across the floor. But then, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. I couldn't tell if they had left the room or if they were still standing there, just outside the door. Suddenly, I heard the sound of sirens, faint at first but growing louder. It was the sound of salvation. I felt a rush of relief, but I wasn't sure if the men had left or if they were still somewhere in the house. I stayed as still as I could, listening for any signs of movement. It wasn't until the police arrived and knocked on my door that I dared to move. The officers quickly swept the house, checking each room. They told me to stay outside while they continued their search. I was shaking uncontrollably, my mind still trying to process what had just happened. The police found evidence that someone had been in the house, including a broken door handle and muddy footprints leading from the back door, but there was no sign of the men. They were gone. What they did find, though, was disturbing. A pillowcase filled with stolen items, a significant amount of cash, jewelry, and other valuables. The man was arrested, but the entire situation left me with more questions than answers. Why had they come to my house? How did they know I was there alone? What were their intentions? I moved out of that townhouse 3 months ago. The thought of living in that place, knowing that someone had been inside watching me, was too much to bear. Even now in my new apartment, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I try to push it away, but I still wonder, who were they? And what did they want? Story 3. The Midnight Intruder. I had always considered myself a pretty independent person. Moving into my first apartment at 22 had been a proud moment. My very own space, a place to call my own. I lived in a cozy 1-bedroom unit on the edge of town, a few blocks from the main street. It wasn't the most glamorous place, but it was mine, and it felt like freedom. I had a steady job at a local convenience store, and my dog Bear was my constant companion. Life was simple, and I liked it that way. But that all changed one fateful night, and my life would never feel quite as safe again. It was a cold night in late winter, and the weather outside was miserable. The wind was howling, and the rain was coming down in sheets. I had just finished my shift at the store and was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. Bear had been restless all day, but I figured he just needed some attention after being cooped up while I worked. I made myself a quick dinner, and Bear sat at my feet, waiting patiently for his own treat. The evening was going as usual, until the knock came. It was around 8:30 p.m., a time when most people were settled in for the night. The knock at the door startled me, causing me to spill my drink. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the knock was insistent, too loud for a simple, neighborly visit. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing with possibilities. Who would come to my door at this hour, especially on a night like this? I peered through the peephole but saw nothing, just darkness outside. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. Maybe it was just someone asking for directions or a delivery, but something about the urgency in the knock made me hesitate. I waited, my hand still resting on the doorknob, but there was no more sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I debated whether or not to open the door. Finally, my curiosity won out, and I cracked the door open just a few inches. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my voice betrayed me. It was shaky, unsure. There was no immediate response. Then, in the dim light, I saw the outline of a man standing at the doorstep, his figure cloaked in shadow. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a hood that obscured most of his face. He didn't say a word at first, just stood there in silence, his presence unsettling. I instinctively pulled the door tighter, but before I could close it fully, he reached out with a gloved hand and pushed it open just enough for him to slip his body through. "Wait," I stammered, panic surging through me as I realized I was no longer in control of the situation. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man stepped forward, his eyes dark and cold under the hood. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said in a calm, almost too calm voice. "I just need your help. I'm in trouble and I don't know where else to turn." His words didn't add up. I didn't know him, and there was something in his voice that set off every alarm in my head. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I can help you. Before I could finish my sentence, the man shoved me back against the wall. The door swung wide open, and in that moment I saw his face fully. His eyes were wide and frantic, but there was something else in them, something that felt predatory, like a hunter cornering its prey. I couldn't move. Fear paralyzed me. My dog Bear was growling low in his throat, sensing the danger, but I couldn't get him to stop. The man's hands gripped my wrist with terrifying strength, and I found myself being pulled into the living room, my heart racing with terror. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. "Please, I just need a place to hide," he whispered desperately. "They're after me." "Who's after you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Before I could get a response, there was a loud bang from outside, like a door slamming open, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. My blood ran cold. It was then that I realized the man wasn't alone. "Shut up," the man hissed, pressing a cold, sharp object to my throat. Something metal, like a knife or a gun, though I couldn't see it clearly. "Don't make any noise. If you scream, I'll make sure you regret it." At that moment, I knew I had no choice but to comply. Every instinct in my body told me to fight, to resist, but the fear of what would happen if I did kept me paralyzed. I could hear voices outside now, louder, closer. It sounded like at least 2 or 3 other men, their boots thudding against the floor in heavy steps. "Where is she?" one of them shouted. I could tell they were looking for me, or rather, they were looking for him. My stomach twisted with dread. What was going on? Who were these people? And why had they come for him? The man holding me against the wall made a quick motion, signaling me to remain silent. His eyes were frantic as he looked around the room, clearly panicked. The sound of the men outside grew louder, and I realized that whatever was happening, I was stuck in the middle of it. I heard the front door creak open. I barely had time to process the next few moments. The man shoved me toward the hallway as his grip tightened, dragging me with him. "Hide in the closet," he hissed. "Do exactly as I say, and I'll get you out of this." In a daze, I stumbled toward the small hallway closet as the men outside grew closer. I could hear their voices clearly now, though they were muffled by the walls. The closet door slammed shut behind me, leaving me in darkness. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stop myself from making a sound, my heart pounding against my ribs. There, in the silence of the closet, I waited, trembling with fear. Time seemed to drag on forever. My thoughts raced, my body shaking as I strained to hear what was happening outside. I could hear the muffled voices of the men talking, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. My mind was spinning, trying to figure out who these people were and what they wanted. Then, suddenly, the sound stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. I waited. It wasn't until several minutes later that I heard the sound of the front door closing softly. The men had gone, and I was left alone in the silence. My chest tightened with a sense of relief, but I knew it wasn't over. They had been so close, and there was no telling when they would return. I slowly opened the closet door, keeping my movements as quiet as possible. The house felt different now, empty and cold. I checked the windows, bolted the doors, and made sure everything was locked. My mind raced, filled with 1,000 questions. What had just happened? Who were those men? And why had they been after him? The police never found the man. They couldn't identify the others who had been involved, and the investigation went cold. I moved out of that apartment as soon as I could, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't safe anymore. I still don't know the full story of what happened that night, but I never want to experience anything like it again. Story 4. The Silent Stalker. It was just after midnight when I found myself walking home from the late shift at the diner. The streets were empty, the usual hum of traffic nowhere to be heard, just the soft patter of my footsteps and the occasional flicker of a streetlight. The city I lived in wasn't huge, but it was large enough to feel isolated at times, especially during the late hours. I had worked the night shift for over a year now, so the darkness wasn't unfamiliar, but tonight, something felt different. I lived on the outskirts of the city, in a small, modest apartment building just off a quiet road. I had a solid routine, working at the diner, running errands, and spending my free time catching up on movies or books. My life was simple, predictable, and for the most part, I liked it that way. But tonight, the usual sense of calm wasn't there. As I walked along the dimly lit road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia, it felt real. There was someone behind me. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the unease. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the empty buildings, too loud in the silence. I turned around casually, trying to seem nonchalant, but there was no one behind me. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, but as I continued walking, that same feeling came creeping back. Someone was there. I could sense it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I began to walk faster, my heart racing in my chest. Still, when I looked behind me, there was nothing, just the empty street, the occasional gust of wind rustling the leaves. The hairs on my arms prickled as I reached the corner of the street, my apartment just a few blocks away. I could hear a faint sound now, a rustling, like someone's footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. No, I couldn't be hearing footsteps. My mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. The sound of shoes hitting the pavement behind me, too soft to be anyone's but my own. I spun around, and for the briefest moment, I saw him. A man, dressed in dark clothes, standing at the end of the street. His figure was cloaked in shadow, too far for me to make out any real details, but his eyes, those eyes, pierced the darkness like two cold spots of light. My heart stopped. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the sidewalk, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I wasn't sure if he was following me, but I couldn't risk it. My apartment was still a few blocks away, and I was already too far into the street. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me again, faster now, as if he had started running. My pulse was a deafening roar in my ears as I reached the building's entrance. The front door was just a few steps ahead, but I couldn't make it. The steps grew louder. I turned around one last time, just as I reached for the door, and I saw him. He was much closer now, a mere 10 feet away. His face was shrouded by the hood he wore, but I could still see the glint of something metallic in his hand. I could feel my stomach drop. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, but finally I managed to unlock the door and rush inside. Slamming it shut behind me, I leaned against it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I didn't even hear him approach. No more footsteps. No sound. Only the oppressive silence that followed me inside. I quickly locked the door and hurried upstairs to my apartment. Bear, my dog, was waiting by the door, wagging his tail and eager to greet me. But I was too shaken. I didn't let him out right away. I stood there in the middle of the room, listening, waiting, but there was nothing. No knock, no sounds of movement, no one at the door. I tried to shake off the panic and carried on with my evening, but I couldn't escape the feeling that someone was out there, watching. The rest of the night I sat in the corner of the couch, glancing nervously at the windows, listening for any sound, footsteps, a voice, anything. I never heard anything else, but something told me it wasn't over. The following night I decided to leave work, early. I needed some sleep, but as I was leaving the diner, the thought crossed my mind. What if the man was still out there? What if I wasn't just imagining it? My heart began to race as I stepped outside into the cold night air. I couldn't see anyone. There was no one in the parking lot, no figures lurking in the shadows. I was alone, but that feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I kept my pace slow as I walked back home, trying to stay aware of everything around me. The street was empty. The world around me felt still. But every corner I turned, every streetlight I passed, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. And then, when I turned the corner to my apartment, I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the block, his face hidden beneath the hood. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, and my stomach twisted in knots. This wasn't a coincidence. I was sure of it now. He was waiting for me to come home. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I stood frozen for a moment, watching him as he slowly moved toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. My heart thudded in my chest as I backed away, glancing behind me at the open path toward the building. He was closing the distance fast. I couldn't outrun him. I ran as fast as I could, but he was too close. Just as I reached the entrance to my apartment building, I felt his hand on my shoulder. I screamed and turned to face him, ready to fight with whatever I could. But when I looked up, expecting to see the cold, unfeeling eyes of the man who had been stalking me for days, I saw nothing. The street was empty. There was no one there, no sign of him anywhere. I stood in the doorway of my building, heart racing, breath coming in short gasps. The feeling of dread settled over me like a thick fog, and I realized in that moment that I was no longer alone. Something had shifted. Someone had been watching me, and now I knew for sure they were not going to let me go. I locked the door and bolted every window in the apartment. It was only when I sat down on the couch with Bear curled up next to me that I realized how tired I was, physically and mentally. I hadn't been able to sleep in days, and now, with everything that had happened, I couldn't escape the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching me. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being stalked. Every time I stepped outside, I checked my surroundings. Every time I heard a knock on the door or saw a shadow move outside my window, my heart would stop. But nothing ever happened again. No more figures lurking, no more footsteps chasing me down the street, no explanation for the terror I had felt. The police couldn't do anything. They found no evidence of anyone following me or lurking around my apartment. But the dread lingered. I never saw the man again, but I couldn't forget the way he made me feel. How his presence, his eyes, his silence, all felt so calculated. I still feel his gaze on me, even now when I'm alone in my apartment, wondering if one day he will return,